You mean nothing to me, the Alpha Mafia boss said, until he came home to an empty house and divorce papers. He cried. If I mean nothing to you, Damien, then why are you so angry that I finally believe you? Ethan Parker's voice was quiet enough to make the question more unsettling than a shout. Damon Cross stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Chicago penthouse. The city glowing 30 stories below him while cold November rain streaked the glass. 10 seconds earlier, anger had made him say the sentence he could already feel becoming permanent. You mean nothing to me. Damien had expected Ethan to argue. He expected tears, accusations, maybe another exhausted attempt to make him discuss a marriage Damien had spent months treating like something that would simply continue because he wanted it to. Instead, Ethan became completely still. I was angry, Damon said. That does not make the words disappear. I did not say it did. Ethan looked at him with an expression Damon could not read. That bothered him. For 3 years, Damien had always known what his husband was feeling. Ethan smiled when he was happy, went quiet when disappointed, and became stubborn whenever Damon tried to protect him by making decisions without asking. Tonight, there was nothing, no anger, no pleading, just a strange calm. Damon loosened his tie. We are not doing this tonight. Ethan gave a small nod. All right. Damon frowned. That is it. You said you do not want to talk. Usually, that does not stop you. The moment the words left his mouth, Damon heard how cruel they sounded. Ethan did too. He looked toward the dining table where dinner had gone cold nearly an hour earlier. 2 plates, 2 glasses, 1 chair that Damien had never sat in because an urgent meeting had kept him away until almost 10. I used to think if I explained things clearly enough, eventually you would understand, Ethan said. Understand what? That being married to someone is not the same as keeping them somewhere safe. Damien's jaw tightened. Everything I do is to keep you safe. I know. Then what is the problem? Ethan looked almost sad now. You really do not know. Damien hated questions he could not solve with money, influence, or a direct order. In his world, uncertainty was weakness. And weakness created consequences. So he did what he had always done. When emotion moved beyond his control, he became colder. I have people waiting on me downstairs. I do not have time for another argument about whether I attend enough dinners. Ethan stared at him for several seconds. You are right. Damon reached for his coat, but something in Ethan's tone stopped him. About what? This is not about dinner. Ethan slowly removed his wedding ring. Damon's entire body went still. The small band rested in Ethan's palm beneath the warm pendant light. Put that back on. Ethan looked at the ring. Why? Because you are my husband. 5 minutes ago, I meant nothing to you. I was angry. You keep saying that as though anger creates a different language. Damien stepped closer. Ethan, do you love me? The question was so direct that Damien stopped. Of course, he did. The answer existed somewhere. Beneath years of discipline, responsibility, and the instinct to never expose anything another person could use against him. But saying it felt dangerously close to surrender. Ethan waited. Damien's silence lasted too long. Something changed in Ethan's eyes. Not heartbreak. Heartbreak had happened earlier, perhaps months earlier. This looked more like acceptance. He placed the ring back on his finger. Damon exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath. Good. Ethan almost smiled. You misunderstood. What? I am wearing it tonight because I made a promise when you gave it to me, and I intend to finish this marriage with more respect than you gave it. Damien stared at him. Finish. Ethan walked past him toward the bedroom. Go to your meeting. Damon followed 2 steps. What does that mean? Ethan stopped at the doorway but did not turn around. It means I finally understand something you have been trying to teach me for a long time. Which is Ethan looked back at the alpha who could make entire rooms fall silent yet had somehow never learned how to say the one sentence his husband needed. You cannot lose something you believe means nothing. Damien felt an unfamiliar pressure settle in his chest. Ethan, what are you doing this time? Ethan's smile was gentle, almost peaceful. I'm going to make it easy for you. Damien stood in the hallway for several seconds after Ethan disappeared into the bedroom, telling himself that the conversation would look different in the morning. Ethan was upset. Damon was angry. They had survived arguments before, and marriage was not something a person simply abandoned because of one terrible sentence. That was what Damon told himself as he took the private elevator downstairs and entered the black sedan waiting beneath the building. Yet halfway to his meeting, he reached for his phone. He opened Ethan's contact, stared at the screen, then locked it again. Calling would turn the argument into something larger. Ethan needed time. Damon needed distance. By tomorrow, everything would return to normal. 30 floors above the city, Ethan heard the penthouse door close and waited until the elevator indicator showed Damon had reached the lobby. Only then did he walk into the bedroom and pull an old suitcase from the back of the closet. He did not pack quickly. There was no panic left in him. That surprised him more than anything. 6 months earlier, imagining this moment would have terrified him. 3 months earlier, it would have broken his heart. Tonight, it felt like completing a decision his heart had been making long before his mind accepted it. Ethan opened the dresser. He took his clothes, leaving behind anything Damon had purchased for formal events. From the bathroom, he packed his toothbrush, medications, shaving kit, and the inexpensive cedarwood soap Damien once complained was too ordinary for their marble bathroom. He smiled faintly at that memory. The smile disappeared when he entered the small reading room beside their bedroom. This was the only room in the penthouse that felt completely like Ethan. The shelves held paperbacks with bent corners, photographs from college, an old ceramic mug his mother had given him, and a blue wool blanket he had bought before meeting Damien. Ethan placed those things carefully into boxes. He left the expensive decorations untouched. He did not want Damien's money. He wanted his own life back. Near midnight, Ethan entered the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator and automatically checked whether Damon's prepared meals were labeled for the week. The habit stopped him. For 3 years, Ethan had remembered everything Damon forgot. Coffee before early meetings, dry cleaning on Thursdays, birthdays of employees Damon respected, but never remembered to acknowledge. The name of the restaurant where Damien's oldest lieutenant liked to take his wife, which shirts Damon preferred before difficult negotiations, which nights he would return home exhausted and pretend he was not. Ethan had turned care into an invisible occupation, and because he had done it quietly, Damon had eventually mistaken it for something that happened by itself. Ethan removed the meal schedule from the refrigerator door and threw it away. At 12:40, he sat at the dining table with a folder an attorney had prepared 2 weeks earlier. He had not expected to use it so soon. The papers did not appear because of tonight's argument. That was the truth Damien would probably struggle to understand. Tonight had only answered the final question. Ethan read every page again. His attorney had structured the separation carefully. Ethan requested no claim on Damien's businesses, no interest in the penthouse, and no unnecessary financial dispute. He wanted the savings that had belonged to him before the marriage, and several personal belongings, nothing more. At 1:15, Ethan's phone lit up. Damien, for one foolish second, hope returned. Ethan answered, "Hello." There was noise in the background, low voices, and the distant sound of traffic. Damon said, "I will be late." Ethan closed his eyes. "All right, do not wait up." Ethan Looked at the packed boxes beside the hallway. I will not. Damon hesitated about earlier. Ethan waited. 3 seconds passed. 4. We will talk tomorrow. Damon finally said something. Inside Ethan became completely quiet. Sure. Good night. Good night, Damien. The call ended. Ethan stared at the phone before setting it face down. Damien had been one sentence away from changing the night. Maybe not the marriage, but the night. He had chosen tomorrow instead. At 2 in the morning, Ethan carried the last suitcase toward the private elevator. A long-time building attendant named Henry helped move the boxes downstairs without asking questions. Ethan appreciated that kindness enough that his voice almost failed when he thanked him. Before leaving, Ethan returned upstairs alone. The penthouse looked strangely untouched. That was the cruelest part. Remove Ethan's books, clothes, photographs, and little pieces of ordinary life, and Damien's home immediately became what it had been before their marriage. Beautiful, expensive, and empty. Ethan entered the bedroom one final time. He removed his wedding ring and held it beneath the bedside lamp. 3 years ago, Damien had placed it on his finger with hands that had trembled almost imperceptibly. Ethan had believed that tiny tremor meant Damien trusted him with the part of himself nobody else could see. Maybe he had. Maybe somewhere along the way, fear had turned that trust into control, and love had become something Damon assumed would remain without being cared for. Ethan placed the ring on the nightstand. Beside it, he left the signed divorce papers. He considered writing a letter, but decided against it. He had spent 3 years explaining himself. Damien could finally experience silence. At 2:23, Ethan stepped into the elevator with one suitcase. The remaining boxes were already downstairs. As the doors began closing, he looked across the penthouse one last time. He expected grief to pull him back. Instead, he felt tired and strangely free. Goodbye, he whispered, not to Damien, but to the version of himself who had kept waiting to become important enough to be chosen. The elevator doors closed, and for the first time since marrying Damon Cross, Ethan left without wondering what time his husband would come home. Damon returned to the penthouse at 6:12 the next morning, expecting to find Ethan asleep. The November sky beyond the windows was still dark, and Chicago looked like a field of scattered lights beneath low clouds. Damien loosened his tie as the elevator doors opened. Ethan, no answer. He stepped inside and immediately noticed the silence. Not ordinary, early morning silence. Something was missing from it. Usually, there was a lamp glowing near the reading room or Ethan's phone charging beside the kitchen counter. Sometimes there was coffee waiting because Ethan somehow knew exactly when Damon would return. This morning, there was nothing. Ethan. Damon called again. He checked the kitchen first, then the living room. Empty. Irritation arrived before concern. Ethan was probably proving a point by sleeping in the guest room. Damon walked toward the bedroom and pushed open the door. The bed had not been slept in. Then he saw the nightstand. A silver wedding ring rested beside a folder. Damon stopped. For several seconds, his mind refused to connect the objects. He crossed the room and picked up the ring first. He recognized a faint scratch along its edge from the summer. Ethan had insisted on helping restore an old wooden table instead of paying someone to do it. Damien had teased him about damaging an expensive ring. Ethan had laughed and said the scratch made it theirs. Damon closed his fingers around it, then opened the folder. Divorce papers. Ethan's signature was already there. Damon read the first page twice without understanding a word. Then he reached for his phone and called. The call went directly to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. On the third attempt, Damon heard his own breathing become uneven. He walked to the closet and opened the doors. Half the space was empty. Ethan's everyday jackets were gone. His sneakers were gone. The old gray sweatshirt Damon secretly hated because Ethan had owned it since college was gone. The formal suits Damon had purchased for him remained untouched. Damon moved faster now. The bathroom cabinet had been cleared of Ethan's personal things. The reading room was worse. Shelves that had once been crowded with paperbacks and photographs now contained expensive decorations Damien barely remembered buying. The blue blanket was gone. The ridiculous ceramic mug was gone. Every ordinary thing Damon had considered clutter had disappeared. And the penthouse suddenly looked like a luxury property staged for sale. Damien called downstairs. Henry answered. "Good morning, Mr. Cross. Did Ethan leave?" Silence lasted 1 second too long. "Yes, sir. When a little after 2 this morning." Damien looked at the clock. "Nearly 4 hours ago." "Where did he go?" "I do not know." "Who picked him up?" Henry hesitated. "A ride-share driver." Damon stared toward the windows. "You let my husband leave alone at 2 o'clock in the morning." Henry's voice remained respectful. "Mr. Parker asked me to help with his boxes." He seemed certain about what he was doing. Damien almost demanded the driver's information. The command reached his throat and stopped there. Ethan had not been taken. He had left. There was a difference and Damon hated it. He ended the call and immediately contacted Ethan's phone again. Voicemail. He opened their messages. Most of the recent conversation was embarrassingly one-sided. Ethan asking whether Damon would be home for dinner. Ethan reminding him about an appointment. Ethan sending photographs of something funny he had seen. Damon's replies were usually 2 words, sometimes 1. "Busy tonight, later." "Fine, thanks." The last message Damien had sent without being prompted was 11 days earlier. He could not remember when he had last asked Ethan how his day was. Damon lowered himself onto the edge of the bed. The divorce papers remained beside him. He told himself Ethan was emotional. He told himself this could be fixed once they spoke. Then he remembered Ethan's face from the night before. There had been no impulsive anger in it. The papers had already been prepared. That realization struck harder than the empty closet. Ethan had been considering leaving before Damien gave him the final reason. Damien called his attorney. It was barely 6:30, but the man answered immediately. "Damien, I received divorce papers." A pause. "From Ethan? Who else would they be from?" "I was asking because you sound surprised." Damien stood. "Find out where he is." "That is not what divorce attorneys do, then find someone who can." Another pause followed. "Damon, before you turn this into a search operation, ask yourself whether Ethan wants to be found." Damien looked down at the ring in his palm. "He is my husband for the moment." "Yes, that does not mean you own his location." Damon nearly ended the call. Instead, he remained silent. His attorney continued more gently. "Read the documents, then decide whether you want to understand what happened or simply regain control of it." The call ended. Damon hated the question because he did not know the answer. He returned to the kitchen and automatically reached for the coffee machine. There were no prepared grounds beside it. No cup waiting. He opened the refrigerator and found neatly labeled meals, but no weekly schedule on the door. He stared at the blank space where it had always been. For the first time, Damien began noticing how many pieces of his life carried Ethan's fingerprints without carrying Ethan's name. At 7:15, Damon stood alone beside the dining table where 2 untouched plates still remained from the night before. He remembered telling Ethan that dinner did not matter. Now the entire penthouse felt like evidence that Ethan had mattered everywhere. Damon opened his hand and looked at the wedding ring again. For years, men had feared disappointing Damon Cross. Employees changed schedules when he entered a room. Business partners returned calls before the second ring. People who knew his reputation rarely told him no. Yet, the one person Damon had assumed would always be waiting had left without asking permission. He picked up the divorce papers and finally began reading every line. Halfway through the second page, Damon discovered something that made him sit down. Ethan was asking for almost nothing. No claim on Damien's businesses, no fight over the penthouse. No demand designed to punish him. Ethan wanted only what had belonged to him before the marriage and a clean legal ending. Damon stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. That was when the truth became impossible to avoid. Ethan was not trying to scare him into becoming a better husband. Ethan was not waiting somewhere for Damien to chase him. Ethan had simply stopped waiting. By noon, Damon had convinced himself that anger was easier than fear. Anger gave him something to do. He cancelled 2 meetings, ignored 3 calls, and had his assistant send someone to handle the dinner he was supposed to attend that evening. None of it helped. The penthouse remained painfully quiet. At 12:30, Damon opened the refrigerator and found 4 containers labeled by day. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Ethan had prepared them before deciding to leave. Damien stood there staring at Ethan's handwriting until he realized what it meant. Even while planning his own departure, Ethan had been thinking about whether Damon would remember to eat. Damon closed the refrigerator without taking anything. An hour later, his dry cleaning arrived. The attendant handed him 6 shirts and said, "Mr. Parker already took care of the payment." Damien nearly corrected him, nearly said Ethan would handle future deliveries differently before remembering there might not be future deliveries for Ethan to handle. That afternoon, Damien's assistant called. "Your anniversary reservation is confirmed for next Friday." Damien stopped walking. "My what?" Silence followed. "The reservation Mr. Parker requested 3 months ago. Private table at the restaurant where you proposed." Damon closed his eyes. Their anniversary was next Friday. He had forgotten. "Cancel it." The words came automatically, but they felt wrong the instant he said them. "Actually, wait." His assistant remained silent. Damon looked toward the empty chair across from him. "Do nothing yet." After the call, he searched his calendar. Ethan's birthday was marked. Their anniversary was marked. A charity dinner Ethan supported was marked. Damon could not remember entering any of them. Ethan had done it. Quietly building reminders into Damien's life so Damien could appear thoughtful without having to remember. The realization was humiliating. By evening, Damon found himself noticing everything else. The fresh flowers in the entryway had begun to droop because nobody had replaced the water. A framed photograph on the hallway table was gone, leaving a pale rectangle where sunlight had not reached the wood. The reading room no longer smelled faintly of cedar wood and coffee. Even the music was missing. Ethan used to play old jazz records on Sunday mornings low enough that Damon could pretend they did not distract him while he worked. Damon had once asked why Ethan always played music when silence was more efficient. Ethan had answered because a home should sound like somebody lives there. Damon had forgotten that conversation until now. He walked through nearly 4,000 square feet of polished stone, glass, and expensive furniture and finally understood what Ethan had meant. This place had never become a home because Damon bought it. Ethan had made it one through hundreds of ordinary decisions Damien never noticed. At 7, one of Damien's senior men, Marcus Reed, arrived with documents requiring approval. Marcus had worked for Damien for 9 years and knew better than to ask personal questions. He still noticed the second untouched coffee cup on the counter. Ethan out. Damon signed the first page. He left. Marcus waited. Damien added. He filed for divorce. Marcus slowly lowered the folder in his hands. I am sorry. Damon hated the sympathy. He will reconsider. Marcus said nothing. What? Damon demanded. Nothing. You clearly have an opinion. Marcus hesitated. You want the respectful answer or the useful one? Damon leaned back. Useful. Marcus nodded toward the empty reading room. Then maybe stop talking about what Ethan will do and start asking why he did it. Damien's expression hardened, but Marcus continued. He came to my daughter's graduation last spring. Damon looked up. What? You sent a gift. Ethan showed up. Damon remembered authorizing an expensive watch for Marcus's daughter. He had considered the obligation handled. Marcus said he sat with my family for 3 hours because he knew I could not leave work until late. When my wife was sick last winter, Ethan sent meals for a week. When one of the younger guys became a father, Ethan remembered the baby's name. People around here respected him, Damien. Not because he was your Omega. Because he paid attention. Damien stared at the unsigned document. Why did nobody tell me? Marcus looked genuinely confused. Tell you what, that he was doing all of that. Because Ethan never acted like it was something you owed him credit for. The answer followed Damon long after Marcus left. That night, Damon tried sleeping but woke before midnight and reached automatically toward the other side of the bed. His hand found cold sheets. He sat up and looked at the empty space. For the first time, he remembered all the nights Ethan had probably done the same thing while Damon was working. The difference was that Ethan had spent years learning how absence felt. Damon had lasted less than 48 hours. At 1:15 in the morning, he walked into the reading room and sat on the floor because Ethan's favorite chair was gone. His phone contained hundreds of photographs. Yet, when he searched Ethan's name, most were pictures Ethan had sent him rather than pictures Damon had taken. A lake at sunset, a crooked birthday cake, snow covering their balcony, 2 coffee cups beside a window, tiny invitations into Ethan's world that Damon had answered with words like nice, busy, later. Then Damon found a photograph from their first year of marriage. Ethan was laughing at something outside the frame, his wedding ring visible around the coffee cup in his hand. Damon stared at the image until the screen dimmed. He had spent years believing love was proven by providing security, money, protection, and a powerful name. Ethan had asked for something far smaller and apparently far more difficult. Presents. Damon unlocked the phone and opened the divorce documents again. For the first time, he stopped thinking about how to bring Ethan home. A different question took its place, one that frightened him because power could not answer it. If Ethan stood in front of him tomorrow, what reason could Damien possibly give him to stay? Damien waited 4 days before looking for Ethan, and every one of those days taught him something he should have learned during 3 years of marriage. He learned that missing someone was not the same as being entitled to their return. He learned that an apology rehearsed in an empty room sounded very different when he imagined saying it to the person he had hurt. Most painfully, he learned that finding Ethan would be easy if he used the machinery of his world. But finding him that way would prove Ethan had been right about him. So Damien did not order anyone to trace a phone, follow a credit card, or search private records. Instead, he called Ethan's attorney. I need to speak with him. The attorney answered calmly. Mr. Parker has asked that all legal communication come through this office. Damon closed his eyes. Tell him I will respect that. Tell him I am asking for one conversation. If he says no, I will not contact him again. The answer came the following afternoon. Ethan agreed to 20 minutes in a public coffee shop in a small town near Lake Michigan, nearly 70 miles from Chicago. Damien drove himself. No driver. No security detail entering with him. No black convoy announcing that Damon Cross had arrived. When he stepped inside, Ethan was already seated near the window, wearing jeans, a dark green sweater, and the old gray coat Damien remembered from their first winter together. He looked ordinary. He looked tired. He also looked more peaceful than Damien had seen him in months. That realization hurt in a way Damon had not prepared for. Ethan looked at the clock on the wall. You are early. So are you. I live nearby now. Damon absorbed the words. Live nearby. Ethan had already created a sentence about his life that did not include Chicago or Damien. He sat across from him. How are you? Ethan's expression changed slightly. Is that what you drove 70 to ask? Damien almost defended himself. Instead, he said no, but I should have asked it more often when I did not have to drive anywhere. Ethan looked down at his coffee. I am all right. Good. Silence settled between them. Damien had negotiated agreements involving millions of dollars without feeling this uncertain. Ethan reached into a canvas bag and placed a pen on the table. Then he placed a copy of the divorce papers beside it. I thought you might save us some time. Damien stared at the pen. You want me to sign them here? Yes. Ethan, I came to talk then talk. Damon had imagined this moment repeatedly. In every version, he had explanations, pressure at work, responsibilities. Ethan did not understand. Enemies who made emotional distance necessary. A childhood that taught Damon affection could become leverage. Every explanation suddenly sounded like a sophisticated way of avoiding three simple words. I hurt you. Ethan looked up. Yes. Damien swallowed. I made you feel alone in a marriage where you should never have been alone. Ethan said nothing. I thought providing for you meant I was taking care of you. I thought keeping danger away from you was enough. It was not. I know. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Slightly. Do you? Damien reached into his coat and removed Ethan's wedding ring. He placed it carefully beside the papers. I have been carrying this since I came home. Ethan looked at it but did not touch it. Damon continued. I noticed everything after you left. The meals, my calendar, Marcus's family, the music, the flowers, all the things you did that I treated like background noise. Ethan's voice remained quiet. You notice because they stopped? Yes, that is not the same as noticing me. Damien had no defense against that. No, it is not. Ethan pushed the pen slightly closer. Then sign. Damon looked at him. His instincts screamed at him to refuse. The alpha in him wanted to solve the problem, stop the separation, insist that 3 years could not end at a coffee shop. But beneath that instinct was the truth Ethan had spent years trying to teach him. Love without choice was only another form of control. Damien picked up the pen. If I sign this, is there any chance for us? Ethan's expression softened, but his answer did not. I cannot promise you that. Do you still love me? Ethan looked toward the gray lake visible beyond the window. That is why leaving was so hard. Damon lowered his eyes. Then why make it final? Because loving you became the reason I accepted things that were hurting me. The sentence landed quietly. Ethan continued, I kept telling myself that if I was patient enough, useful enough, understanding enough, eventually you would choose me without being reminded. I do not want to live like that anymore. Damon looked at the signature line. I could change. Maybe you do not believe me. I believe you want to change because losing me hurts. Ethan met his eyes. I need to know whether you can change when getting me back is not the reward. Damien stared at him for a long moment. Then he signed his name. Ethan's breath caught so softly. Damon almost missed it. Damon placed the pen down and slid the papers across the table. Then there is no reward. Ethan looked at the signature. Damien, you asked me to respect your choice. I should have learned how to do that before you had to leave. He stood, leaving the wedding ring between them. Ethan looked up. What happens now? Damien wanted to say that he would wait. He wanted to promise that he would become someone Ethan could love again. Instead, he gave Ethan the first answer in their marriage that demanded nothing from him. Now you build the life you wanted. Ethan's eyes became bright. But Damon did not reach across the table. And you? He asked. Damon looked at the man he still loved and finally understood that regret was not redemption. I go home alone, he said. And figure out why I made the person I loved feel lonelier beside me than he does without me. Damien returned to Chicago before sunset, and for the first time in years, he entered the penthouse without expecting anyone to make the silence easier for him. Ethan's signed copy of the divorce papers was gone. The wedding ring had remained with Ethan, and Damien carried nothing home except the consequences of his own choices. He poured a glass of water, sat at the dining table, and stayed there until the city lights appeared beyond the windows. His first instinct was to work. Work had always been useful because numbers did not ask whether he was emotionally available and business problems could usually be solved by applying enough pressure. He opened his laptop, read the same paragraph 3 times, then closed it. Ethan's question from the coffee shop would not leave him alone. Could Damon change when getting Ethan back was not the reward? The following morning, Damien called Marcus into his office. I need you to start telling me when I am being unreasonable. Marcus stared at him. That sounds dangerous. For you or me? Historically, both. Damien almost smiled. I am serious. Marcus sat across from him. Then stop treating every disagreement like disobedience. The answer came so quickly that Damon frowned. You had that prepared for approximately 7 years. Damon leaned back. Normally, he would have ended the conversation there. Instead, he asked, what else? Marcus hesitated, then gave him a list long enough to become uncomfortable. Damien interrupted people. He expected immediate answers at unreasonable hours. He confused loyalty with availability. He solved personal problems with money because money allowed him to avoid emotional conversations. Worst of all, when he cared deeply about someone, he tried to remove every uncertainty from that person's life until protection became control. Damien listened without defending himself. That afternoon, he changed several standing rules. His senior people would have protected personal time unless there was a genuine emergency. Employees with families would no longer be expected to attend meetings that could wait until morning. Decisions affecting another person's responsibilities would include that person in the conversation. Marcus read the new policy and looked suspicious. Is this because of Ethan? Damien considered lying. It started because of Ethan. And now I am realizing he was not the only person who had to adapt to me. That evening, Damon did something even harder. He called a therapist whose number his attorney had quietly sent him months earlier. The first appointment was uncomfortable. Damon spent 20 minutes explaining why emotional restraint had kept him alive in a world where vulnerability could be exploited. The therapist listened and finally asked, "Has it also cost you anything?" Damien thought about an empty bedroom and answered, "My marriage." Over the following weeks, the question changed shape. Damien began remembering his childhood, a father who praised obedience but mocked tenderness, a household where affection was treated as leverage, and years spent learning that the safest person was the one nobody could emotionally reach. Becoming an alpha had reinforced the lesson, becoming powerful had rewarded it. Then Ethan had entered his life and asked for something Damien had never practiced. Giving freely, not protection, access. Damien had loved Ethan, but he had loved him from behind locked doors. Understanding that did not excuse anything. It only showed Damien what needed to change. He did not contact Ethan. Twice he typed messages and deleted them. Once he saw a photograph Marcus's wife had posted from a community fundraiser near Lake Michigan. And Ethan was visible in the background carrying boxes of donated books. Damien stared at the photograph longer than he should have. Ethan looked thinner. Perhaps, but he was smiling. Damon did not ask where the fundraiser was. That restraint felt absurdly small compared with the things he had once controlled. Yet, it mattered because nobody was watching. 2 months passed. The divorce became final on a cold January morning. Damien received confirmation while sitting in his office. He read the notice, placed his phone face down, and allowed himself to grieve instead of burying the feeling beneath work. Marcus entered 10 minutes later and immediately. Understood. Final. Damien nodded. You all right? No. Marcus waited. Damon added, but I will be. It was the first time he could remember admitting weakness without feeling ashamed of it. That evening, he returned home before 7. The penthouse had changed, too. Damon had stopped replacing Ethan's absence with expensive objects. The dining table was smaller now. Several rooms had been redesigned because Damon finally admitted that 4,000 square feet had never made him feel secure. He cooked dinner badly, ate it anyway, then washed the dishes himself. Before bed, he opened a drawer containing the few photographs Ethan had left behind. Damien no longer used them as evidence that Ethan belonged with him. They were evidence that Ethan had once trusted him with a life Damien had failed to appreciate. Damon closed the drawer. Somewhere nearly 70 miles away, Ethan was building something new, and Damien had no right to interrupt it simply because loneliness had finally taught him what love should have taught him earlier. For years, Damon Cross had believed strength meant never allowing another person to determine his emotional balance. Now he understood something far more difficult. Sometimes strength meant accepting that the person you loved might never return and becoming better. Anyway, for the first time since Ethan walked away, Damien stopped asking himself how to win his Omega back. He began asking a harder question. If Ethan never saw him again, what kind of man did Damon still want to become? By early spring, Ethan had learned that peace was quieter than happiness, but far easier to trust. He rented the second floor of a small house less than a mile from Lake Michigan, where the windows faced a row of maple trees instead of Chicago towers, and nobody downstairs cared who his former husband had been. His apartment was modest enough that the entire living room could have fit inside Damon's old dining area, but every object inside belonged there because Ethan had chosen it. The blue wool blanket rested across a second-hand couch. His mother's ceramic mug sat beside the coffee maker. Paperbacks filled mismatched shelves he had assembled himself. And on Sunday mornings, Ethan played jazz without wondering whether the music might interrupt someone's work. He had also found a job coordinating programs for a community arts center. Work that paid far less than anything connected to Damien's world, but gave him something money had never provided. A place where his attention was appreciated rather than expected. People learned his name before they learned he was an Omega. They asked for his ideas. They invited him to lunch. When he stayed late, it was because he chose to. The first few weeks had still been difficult. Freedom did not erase grief. Some mornings, Ethan woke expecting to hear Damon on the phone in another room. Sometimes he reached for his wedding ring before remembering his hand was bare. He missed Damien in ways that embarrassed him because divorce had ended the marriage without erasing 3 years of loving the man inside it. But Ethan stopped treating that love as evidence that leaving had been a mistake. He could miss Damien and still choose himself. That realization changed everything. In March, Marcus's wife Claire called Ethan about a charity book drive they had once organized together. She carefully avoided discussing Damien until Ethan finally asked, "How is he?" Claire became quiet. "Do you want the polite answer?" Ethan smiled despite himself. Apparently, everyone around Damien has started asking that question. Claire laughed. "Then you already know something has changed." Ethan waited. "He is different," she said. "Not dramatically. That is probably why I believe it." Ethan looked out his kitchen window toward the bare branches beginning to show their first signs of green. "Different how Marcus comes home for dinner now." Ethan said nothing. Claire continued. "Damon stopped scheduling unnecessary evening meetings. He asks people what they think and actually waits for the answer. Last month, Marcus disagreed with him in front of everyone." "Is Marcus still employed?" "That was my question, too." Ethan laughed and the sound surprised him. Claire softened. "I'm not telling you this because I think you should go back. I know. I just thought you might want to know he did not turn your leaving into another excuse to become worse." After they hung up, Ethan sat with that information longer than he intended. Part of him had expected Damien to change for 2 weeks, perhaps a month, then return to old habits when Ethan did not come back. Instead, nearly 4 months had passed. Damien had not called. He had not sent flowers. He had not appeared outside Ethan's apartment or used someone else to deliver messages. Ethan had asked for space and Damien had given him so much of it that sometimes the silence hurt. That was the strange contradiction Ethan had not anticipated. The behavior he had once begged for was now happening where he could not see it. And that made it more meaningful, not less. In April, Ethan received a plain envelope from Damien's attorney. His stomach tightened until he opened it and discovered only a final property document requiring confirmation. No hidden letter, no personal message, no attempt to turn paperwork into an excuse for contact. Ethan signed it and mailed it back. That night, he took a long walk beside the lake. The wind was cold enough to make him pull his coat tighter, but the sunset spread orange across the water, and Ethan remembered sending Damien photographs of evenings like this. "Nice." Damien used to reply, "Sometimes just beautiful." Ethan had once believed those short responses meant Damon did not care. Now he wondered whether Damon had cared deeply and simply lacked the courage to participate in anything he could not control. Understanding was not forgiveness, and it certainly was not reconciliation. Ethan had become careful about those distinctions. He was no longer building a case for why Damien deserved another chance. He was building a life that would remain whole whether Damon ever entered it again. By May, Ethan had been promoted to program director. His co-workers surprised him with a cake in the break room. And when they asked what he wanted to do with the center summer schedule, Ethan realized nobody was waiting for permission from someone more powerful. They were waiting for his decision. He smiled and began outlining his ideas. That evening, Ethan returned to his apartment carrying leftover cake and found himself standing in the doorway, looking at the little home he had created. Nothing about it was impressive by Damien's standards. The couch was still second-hand. One bookshelf leaned slightly to the left. The kitchen light flickered whenever the dishwasher started. Ethan loved every imperfect inch. His phone rang. Claire's name appeared on the screen. "Please tell me Marcus did not volunteer me for another fundraiser," Ethan said when he answered. "Not exactly." Something in her voice made him straighten. "What happened?" "There is a foundation dinner in Chicago next week. The Arts Center is receiving a grant. So, your director submitted your name months ago as the program representative." Ethan remembered the paperwork. "All right." Claire hesitated. "Damon's organization is one of the donors." Ethan became still. 6 months earlier, hearing Damien's name would have made his entire future feel uncertain. Now he looked around his apartment and understood that nothing he had built depended on what happened next. Does he? No, I will be there. Ethan asked. I do not think so. Ethan walked to the window and watched the last light settle over the lake. Then do not tell him. Claire was quiet. Are you sure? Ethan thought about the man he had left. The man Claire claimed was changing and the man Ethan himself had become without him. Yes, he said. If we meet again, I want it to happen without either of us preparing a performance for the other. The first thing Ethan noticed when he entered the hotel ballroom was that Damon was laughing. Not the controlled smile he used for business dinners, but an actual laugh, brief and unguarded. While Marcus said something beside him, Ethan stopped near the entrance. 6 months had passed since he walked out of the penthouse, and he had prepared himself for anger, longing, even disappointment. He had not prepared for the strange relief of seeing Damien looked human. Then Damien turned. Their eyes met across nearly 40 feet of crowded tables, and the smile disappeared from his face. For one suspended moment, neither man moved. Ethan could almost recognize the old Damien in the stillness. The alpha who would have crossed the room immediately because wanting something had once been reason enough to claim the space around it. Instead, Damien stayed where he was. He gave Ethan a small nod, nothing more. The choice remained Ethan's. That simple restraint affected him more than any dramatic reunion could have. Ethan returned the nod and joined his co-workers. The evening continued. He spoke with donors, accepted congratulations for the Arts Sense grant, and presented a short overview of the summer programs. When he finished, applause filled the ballroom. Ethan stepped away from the podium and saw Damien clapping with everyone else. No possessive pride, no expression suggesting Ethan's success belonged somehow to him, just quiet respect. They did not speak until almost an hour later when Ethan stepped onto a terrace overlooking downtown Chicago for fresh air. The door opened behind him and Damon appeared. He stopped several feet away. May I come out? Ethan almost smiled at the question. You already did. I can go back inside. You can stay. Damien walked to the railing but left comfortable space between them. Congratulations. Thank you. Program director suits you. Ethan glanced at him. Claire told you. Marcus mentioned it after you were promoted. I told him not to give me details you had not chosen to share. Ethan absorbed that quietly. That does not sound like you. Damien looked toward the city. It did not used to. There was no demand for praise in his voice. Ethan appreciated that. You look different, Ethan said. I changed my tailor. Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. Damon smiled. There it is. What? Nothing. He caught himself immediately. Sorry. Old habit. The correction was so quick and unperformed that Ethan's amusement faded into something warmer. Damien reached into his coat pocket. There is something I wanted to return if I ever saw you again. He removed a small photograph and placed it on the railing between them. Ethan recognized it immediately. Their first apartment before the penthouse before Damien's world had expanded around them. They were standing in a tiny kitchen with mismatched cabinets. Both smiling at whoever had taken the picture. Ethan picked it up carefully. I thought this was lost. It was behind a drawer in the reading room. You kept it for a while. Damon's voice softened. Then I realized it was yours. Your mother took it. Ethan looked at the photograph. You could have mailed it. I could have. Damon paused. I wanted one honest reason to speak to you if we ever met again. Then I decided that was still an excuse, so I waited. Ethan looked at him. The man standing beside him was still unmistakably Damon Cross. Controlled posture, expensive suit, the quiet authority that made people notice when he entered a room, but something fundamental had shifted. Damon no longer seemed to believe authority entitled him to an outcome. "Claire says, Marcus comes home for dinner now," Ethan said. Damon sighed. "Marcus has apparently turned my personal development into public information. She also said, you listen when people disagree with you. That remains unpleasant." Ethan smiled, but I survive it." Silence returned, comfortable this time. Ethan finally asked the question he had been carrying since spring. "Why did you never contact me?" Damien did not answer immediately. "Because you asked for a life that was yours. You could have sent one message. I wanted to many times." Damien looked directly at him. "But wanting access to you was exactly how I used to justify ignoring what you wanted." Ethan lowered his eyes to the photograph. "I thought maybe you stopped caring." Damien's expression tightened. No, the single word contained more emotion than many speeches Ethan had once begged him to give. "I cared enough to finally understand that missing you was my problem to carry, not yours to fix." Ethan felt his throat tighten. Damon continued before Ethan could answer. "I did not come over here to ask you back." Ethan looked up. "You did not?" "No." "Then what do you want?" Damien considered the question. "To tell you I am sorry without attaching a request to the apology." He took a slow breath. "I am sorry I made you compete with my work for basic attention. I am sorry I treated protection as permission to make choices for you. I am sorry I let you spend years proving your love while I behaved as though mine did not need to be demonstrated." Ethan remained silent. Damien did not fill the silence. "And I am especially sorry," he continued, "that I said something cruel because I was angry and trusted you to remain after hearing it." Ethan's eyes burned, but he held Damon's gaze. "I needed to hear that." "I know." Damien stepped back from the railing. "You do not owe me anything for saying it." The ballroom doors opened behind them as several guests came outside. Damien glanced toward the entrance. "I should let you enjoy your evening." Ethan looked at the photograph. Then at him. "Damien." He stopped. 6 months ago, Ethan would have interpreted this moment as destiny and rushed toward the future he wanted. He was not that man anymore. He did not need to decide tonight whether forgiveness meant another chance. "Are you free Sunday morning?" Damon's expression changed, but he kept his voice calm. "Yes, there is a coffee shop near my apartment." 10 o'clock, Damien nodded. "I would like that." Ethan pointed at him. "Coffee?" "Nothing more." "Coffee?" Damon agreed. He started toward the door. Then Ethan spoke again. "And Damon?" "Yes." Ethan held up the old photograph. "Thank you for giving this back." Damon looked at him with a softness. Ethan remembered from before power had taught both of them the wrong lessons about love. "It was always yours," he said. This time, when Damon walked away, Ethan did not feel abandoned. For the first time in their history, the Alpha had left the next step entirely in the Omega's hands. Sunday coffee became another coffee 2 weeks later, then a walk along the lake in June, then dinner at a neighborhood restaurant where Damon arrived without an assistant calling every 10 minutes. Ethan noticed the changes because Damon never announced them. When his phone buzzed during dinner, Damon checked the screen and said, "It can wait." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Who are you and what have you done with Damon Cross?" Damon smiled. "Therapy has been deeply inconvenient." Ethan laughed and Damon laughed with him. They did not pretend. The past had disappeared. When Damien slipped into old habits, Ethan told him. When Ethan became quiet, instead of explaining what bothered him, Damon asked rather than assuming. Sometimes those conversations were uncomfortable. That was exactly why Ethan trusted them. Their old marriage had been built around avoiding discomfort until resentment became easier than honesty. Whatever they were building now would have to survive truth. By August, Damon had visited Ethan's apartment several times, always because Ethan invited him. The first time, Damon stood in the tiny living room, studying the second-hand couch, crooked bookshelf, and flickering kitchen light. Ethan crossed his arms. "Do not say it. I have not said anything. You are thinking expensive thoughts." Damien looked offended. "I was thinking the bookshelf has character." "Liar." Damon smiled. "I was also thinking I know someone who could fix that light." Ethan pointed toward the door. "Dangerous territory." "Understood." The next weekend, Damon arrived carrying coffee and nothing else. He did not fix the light. That mattered more than Ethan expected. In October, nearly a year after the night everything ended, Ethan returned to Chicago for another foundation event. Afterward, Damon asked whether he wanted to see the penthouse. Ethan hesitated before agreeing. The elevator doors opened and Ethan immediately noticed the difference. The place was still elegant, but it no longer looked untouched. Books rested on the coffee table. A jacket hung over a chair. A slightly crooked framed photograph sat near the window. Ethan stared at it. It was a picture of Lake Michigan at sunset, one Ethan had sent Damon years earlier. "You printed it." Damon stood several feet behind him. "I realized I had hundreds of invitations into your life sitting inside my phone." Ethan looked around. "It feels different here. I stopped trying to make everything perfect." "That must have been traumatic." "I am recovering." They ate takeout at the smaller dining table Damon had bought after the divorce. Halfway through dinner, Ethan noticed Damon watching him. "What?" "Nothing." Ethan gave him a warning look. Damien corrected himself. "Actually, something." He stood and walked toward the bedroom. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. Ethan's heart immediately accelerated. "Damien, this is not what you think." That sentence has never made anyone less nervous. Damon sat down and opened the box. Inside was Ethan's old wedding ring. Ethan stared at it. "I thought I kept that." "You did? Your attorney returned it with the final property documents because it had originally been purchased through one of my accounts." Ethan had forgotten. Damon continued. "I kept it because I did not know what else to do with it, but I do now." He closed the box and slid it across the table. "It belongs to you. What happens to it should be your decision." Ethan touched the lid but did not open it again. "Why tonight?" "Because tomorrow is 1 year since I said the thing that ended our marriage." Ethan became still. Damon's voice remained steady. "I remember the exact date. Because it is the day I learned that loving someone privately does not excuse failing them publicly, emotionally, or repeatedly." Ethan looked down. "We were both unhappy. Do not make my part smaller to make this easier for me." Ethan looked back up. That answer told him more than any apology could have. Damien continued, "I love you. I have loved you the entire time, but I am not asking you to erase what happened." "What are you asking?" "Nothing tonight." Ethan laughed softly. "You have become annoyingly patient. Marcus says the same thing, although he uses different language." Ethan looked at the wooden box, then across the table at the Alpha he had once loved so desperately that he forgot to protect his own happiness. He still loved Damien. The difference was that love no longer felt like surrender. 3 months later, on a cold January morning, Damon came to Ethan's apartment for breakfast. Snow covered the maple branches outside. The kitchen light still flickered occasionally because Ethan had stubbornly refused to replace it. After coffee, Ethan reached into a drawer and placed the wooden box on the table. Damon looked at it but said nothing. Ethan opened it. The old ring remained inside. "I do not want this one," Ethan said. Damon's face revealed nothing, but Ethan saw his shoulders tighten. "All right," Ethan smiled. That was not the end of the sentence. Damon exhaled. "You are becoming cruel. I learned from an expert." Ethan closed the box. "If we ever marry again, I do not want the old ring. I do not want the old marriage either." Damien looked at him carefully. "What do you want?" "Something we choose now. Not because you are an alpha. Not because I am your omega. Not because leaving would embarrass you or staying would make me feel secure." Ethan reached across the table. "I want a relationship where either of us can say what we need without fearing what it will cost." Damon took his hand. "I want that, too." 6 months later, beside Lake Michigan, Damon stood with Ethan beneath the maple trees outside the Arts Center after a small summer fundraiser. There was no audience waiting for a performance, only a few friends still cleaning up inside. Damon removed a simple ring from his pocket. He did not kneel immediately. "May I ask you something?" Ethan smiled. "You just did." Damien laughed. Then he became serious. "If your answer is no, nothing between us changes." I mean that. Ethan believed him. That was why when Damien finally asked whether Ethan would choose a new marriage with him, Ethan did not think about the penthouse, the empty room, or the papers that had once ended everything. He thought about every ordinary day afterward when Damon had changed without demanding credit, every boundary he had respected, every conversation they had finished instead of escaping. "Yes," Ethan said. Damon's eyes closed for one brief second before he smiled. Ethan held out his hand. The new ring was simpler than the first, chosen together weeks earlier without either of them admitting why. Damon placed it carefully on Ethan's finger. This time, neither man made promises about never leaving. They promised something harder. They would speak before silence became distance. Listen before protection became control. And remember that being chosen once never guaranteed being chosen forever. Years earlier, Damien had believed love meant keeping Ethan safe inside the life he provided. Ethan had believed love meant staying until Damon finally understood him. They had both been wrong. Love was not possession, endurance, or fear of losing someone. It was the freedom to walk away and the courage to return only when returning was truly a choice.